Good evening. It's a great pleasure to welcome you again to, as Matt just mentioned, the last lecture of this season. Welcome to the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures, West Asia and North Africa. And we want to invite you to come to North Africa tonight with our speaker, Peter Der Manuelian. He just disappeared, who is clearly a man of many talents. He received his PhD right here in this building at U Chicago in 1990, when this building was still called the Oriental Institute. And right now, he is the Barbara Bell Professor of Egyptology, both in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations in Harvard, and also in the Department of Anthropology at, of course, the same university. Meanwhile, he is also the director of the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East, formerly known as the Harvard Museum of Harvard Semitic Museum, so he knows everything about name changes. Before that, before coming to Harvard in 2000, between 1987 and 2000, he spent 13 years on the curatorial staff of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He is also, right now, director of the Giza project at Harvard, about whom I'm sure we will hear tonight. And I'm reading here from his own description. This Giza project at Harvard aims to collect and present online all past, present, and future archaeological activity at the Giza Pyramids. And as we will see tonight, his research and teaching interests include visualization and digital humanities approaches to the ancient world. Professor Der Manuelian is a very prolific author. I have counted on his CV no less than 8 books and many, many articles. And his most recent book, which he brought in tonight, and it's over 1,000 pages, Walking Among Pharaohs. The subtitle is George Reisner and the Dawn of Modern Egyptology. So it is a work of scholarly history. I just asked Professor Der Manuelian, is there, I know the German term Wissenschaftsgeschichte, history of scholarship. Is there a similar concise term in English? And we both couldn't think of one. But so that is one of his interests. I will actually put this out there on the podium for you to peruse after the lecture if you are interested. And Emily Teeter, all very well known to you, brought in also as part of Show and Tell another of his books. So you can see either he writes very hefty volumes or these otherwise outsized volumes, Slab Stelae of the Giza Necropolis. So I'll put them out there on the podium for you. I'm sorry?
He wrote and designed.
Wrote and designed. That's why the format. Yeah. And he has also written, which I found very interesting, a number of children's books, all, of course, about ancient Egypt. So in tonight's lecture, we will hear, no doubt, some of those same themes, like visualization of the ancient past, also Wissenschaftsgeschichte, and other things. And so I invite you to his lecture, Visualizing the Pyramids, Old Digs, New Technology, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming Professor Der Manuelian.
Thank you, Theo, and thank you, Matt, for wonderful introductions. Yes, we've been rescheduling this talk so many times. I think I had a lot more hair when we first did the schedule. So I'm absolutely delighted to be back here. It's a privilege after so many years. In fact, we came in yesterday, and my wife and I even had some time to go downtown and play tourists a little bit, which was great because as a graduate student, I had no time for such things. And the city is just expanded amazingly and beautifully. It's just wonderful stuff. Speaking of student days, I'd like to thank my own professors from way back when. Klaus Baer, Ed Wente, and Jan Johnson taught me so much and helped set me on my way. So I'd like to just give a shout out to them. This is one of my favorite places. This is one of my other favorite places, and I hope that we can take a tour of it a little bit today. This is what I'd like to try to do. We'll see if we get through all of that. I will talk fast and try to keep you entertained. I thought I'd start just very briefly with some overview of what the site is all about. Giza, about an hour or so west of modern Cairo, depending on traffic. And then a little bit about recent excavation history. My favorite archaeologist from the American side of things. I shouldn't say that too loud because we have another favorite archaeologist and Egyptologist on the wall right there, George Reisner, and some of his entanglements with James Breasted. A bit of the highlights of Giza discoveries over the years, and then what we do with all of that stuff, both the antiquities and the archaeological legacy. And then finally, some of the fun, trying to look at new ways to research and to teach about these sites with visualization technologies. And then finally, a surprise, trying to give some voice to those who often don't get the voice. And that is, of course, the Egyptians who were involved in all of this. So strap in. We'll see if we can get through all of that material. I hope it will be fun. So just a brief refresher here to orient you to the site. The Great Pyramid, the second and the third, built in this order from right to left, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. You'll often find the Greek forms of these names to be more politically correct and accurate. We use the Egyptian now, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. You see the Sphinx there as well. Old Kingdom, Pyramid Age, Dynasty 4 is what they date to, so think roughly 2,500 BCE or so. And the pyramids were never lost, they were never buried, but what you see all around them these were the mastaba tombs. Mastaba is just an Arabic word for bench, referring to the rectangular structure of these tombs. And these are the non-royal tombs surrounding the three royal pyramids. So they were largely obscured at the time of the great expeditions. And in them are the frozen moments of just about any aspect of Egyptian culture you might want to study. Their decorated chapel walls have incredible scenes of, you name it, agriculture, gender relations, craftsmanship, ritual, costume, anything you want to know, history, autobiographical text. They are just loaded. So we are still asking questions about this site, how it developed, what it means for the social history of the Old Kingdom, and the ages that followed as well. I like to think of about 3 golden ages when I think about Giza, maybe all of ancient Egypt as well. The first golden age is, of course, the Old Kingdom, the Pyramid Age, when all of this stuff came together as the evidence of a rather centralized state, tremendous project management skills, and an amazing social hierarchy and organization. So that's Golden Age 1. Golden Age 2 would be the first half of the 20th century. That's the era of the great expeditions. In Golden Age 3, I'm biased, right now, because of the incredible archaeological sciences we have, the digital humanities, the new technologies that we can apply, we can ask and hopefully answer new research questions that just weren't available to the earlier scholars. Well, this is not one of those 3 golden ages. This is a little bit earlier, and we don't have time to go into a whole history of Giza exploration. There were, of course, visitors and writers through the ages, people by the name of Howard Weiss, the British explorer Giovanni Belzoni, who was a circus strongman turned excavator, Auguste Mariette, who founded the Antiquities Service in 1858. Big turning point, of course, was Napoleon and his invasion, quote unquote, but bringing all of those savants or scholars with him, they did a lot better job than Napoleon's army. And of course, the discovery of the Rosetta Stone set Egyptology off as a somewhat modern discipline. They got to Giza too and did lots of measurements and reproductions and things. That takes us to great ones such as Flinders Petrie. Petrie and George Reisner together could be called the fathers of modern archaeological method. There he is on the left outside his tomb at Giza, and on the right in a 3D model, welcome to his bedroom. He was living where that red dot is on the map, just to the east of the Great Pyramid of Khufu. In 1880, that was his first trip to Egypt to try to measure the pyramids and see if any of these crazy interpretations of the mysterious wonders of the ancient world were accurate or not. And so there he was in his element. On the right, I had a photo of a more recent inspector taking the same pose for fun. But that takes us then to Golden Age number 2, so the great era of these incredible expeditions. And our hero on the left is George Reisner. And he was not alone in wanting to excavate at the site. This was a reaction to the plunder that was going on, the unregulated, unrecorded excavations here and there. And these scholars that you see here were just chomping at the bit to get in there and do it in a more responsible way. So there was an American expedition interested in Giza, and an Italian and a German. And the first three were Reisner and Schiaparelli for the Italians from Turin, and Georg Steindorf over there. The other two, Hermann Juncker, eventually switched places. Juncker was in the Sudan and wanted to dig at Giza. Steindorf was at Giza and wanted to dig in the Sudan, so they switched positions in 1912. And then later, when the Germans were expelled from Egypt because of the wars, Salim Hassan led the first Egyptian-directed expedition at Giza. So these were the big three, the first three major expeditions at Giza. And how it broke down is as follows. So here we are looking straight down again. There's the Great Pyramid of Khufu, second one of Khafre, and the smallest of Menkaure. The Great Western Cemetery, all of those mastabas laid out by Khufu in symmetrical rows and streets, and just beautifully done, later filled in, and Khufu probably would have turned over in his pyramid if he could see the chaos that was brought to his ordered streets and avenues of the cemetery. More of his royal family members in the Eastern Cemetery here. This was the quarry zone called the Central Field, which is now the dissertation topic of one of my students. And after it supplied all of the blocks for the core of Khufu's pyramid, it too became a cemetery as well. So dividing up the pyramids is what these three concessionaires were told to do. They met on the terrace of the Mina House Hotel, which is still there, drew lots out of a hat. And in the upper right image, that's the original breakdown of who got what. So the yellow areas are what the Americans under Reisner got, the northern strip of the Western Cemetery, a little of the east, and the third and smallest pyramid. The Germans got the blue zone, and in sort of orange is what the Italians got. The Italians wanted texts and papyri, though, and after a few short seasons, they gave up and they headed south and wanted to excavate elsewhere. So Reisner inherited their zones, and that's why in the lower right image you see more yellow, more American, more Reisner concession, and the Germans are still there. And then we have the new color in green, which is where Salim Hassan and the Egyptians took over when that was no longer part of the German concession. So Reisner and the Americans ended up excavating 2/3 of Giza. And that is why he is the one who's contributed more than any other to our knowledge of the site, this Old Kingdom Pyramid Age site. The two greatest American Egyptologists of the time, your own James Breasted, shown here, and Reisner. Breasted was history and language, Reisner was archaeology, and the two of them had quite an interesting friendship over the years. They knew each other from their very first conferences in this country. They met again in Berlin. Breasted was getting his PhD in Berlin. Reisner was a postdoc there. The Reisners attended the Breasted's wedding in Berlin, for example. And Breasted visited Egypt, of course, many times, and visited Reisner, who was living at the pyramids as his headquarters. Now, both men are not without controversies, and we're working so hard in the field now to decolonize aspects of it, and both of them are somewhat guilty of this in different ways, but that's a story mainly for another lecture, and I want to emphasize today some of the great archaeological, historical, philological achievements that they both made as well. Now, a big difference between these two, well, a similarity is they're both from the Midwest. A great difference is that Reisner lived in Egypt pretty much all the time, Breasted, of course, back and forth from this building to Egypt and back. And if you're living at the pyramids, then you're right on the front lines. And Reisner was there all the time, practically nonstop. He only came back to Boston to curate at the MFA and to teach at Harvard just a few semesters. So everybody came to Giza, the politicians, the celebrities, royalty. It's still happening today. Jill Biden was just there a couple of days ago. Here is the Belgian King Albert with the Antiquities chief Pierre Lacaux coming to take a tour in March of 1930 at the pyramids, and you'll see Reisner there doffing his cap and welcoming them and about to bring them on a tour of the Great Eastern Cemetery. So who was this guy? Trying to get a handle on some of the personalities of these earliest scholars is something that absolutely fascinates me. We can look at the sites, we can look at the statues and the discoveries, but the people behind them have just as much to do with the glory and the fascination that we have with the ancient monuments themselves. So who was George Reisner? Born in Indianapolis in 1867, Midwestern boy, just like Breasted. Harvard class of 1889. He also did a master's and a PhD there. You're looking at his senior class photo right there in front of the famous Memorial Hall. And by his last few years, he was fascinated by ancient languages and mainly Assyriology, nothing to do with ancient Egypt, offered at Harvard at this time. His professor and mentor was David Gordon Lyon, the first Assyriologist in the US, who raised the money to build our Isaac. This is the Semitic Museum, now the H Main, Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East. And Lyon was creating a sort of seminar along the German principles that he had learned from studies in Leipzig. So it was all Semitic language family study for Reisner at this point, nothing to do with digging. Lyon sent him to Berlin because he'd studied in Germany too. And so as a postdoc for 3 years, Reisner ended up there, and all of the great professors in Berlin you see in yellow there, all of their language teaching is listed, and Reisner was taking all of these courses. But important for us were these two folks, actual Egyptologists that he met there and studied with, the great Adolf Ehrmann and his protege and superstar pupil, Kurt Zeta. And Reisner studied Egyptian and hieratic and learned the ways of Egyptology there too. So by the time he came back to Harvard, he was ready to teach Egyptology at Harvard for the very first time. He felt that the joke was on him though, because after 1 year, there was no money to keep him. So he thought he'd really pulled something special off in Berlin. He'd published as the only American in the German journals, came home and really only was a lecturer for a year. That may be a familiar story to some struggling in academia. There wasn't enough money. But he was rescued by these individuals and other German friends because they put together an international commission in Cairo to publish aspects of the Cairo Museum collection, and they wanted him as the American representative. So he got this invitation, first regular paying job, and before you know it, he thought he would take a year in Egypt and join these others. You see a couple of iterations of the Cairo catalog commission here, and they worked in happy cooperation, publishing their various aspects. Reisner worked on amulets, on models of ships and boats, and on canopic jars. What nobody knows, those are all published books eventually. What no one knows is he actually worked on the Amarna tablets as well. So he hadn't quite let go of the cuneiform script that he was originally trained in. This is the manuscript, never published, still in the Cairo Museum in Reisner's own handwriting. But this is when the fateful meeting took place. He came in contact in Egypt with Phoebe Apperson Hearst, mother of William Randolph Hearst, the Rupert Murdoch of his time. And she was looking for people to excavate in support of her philanthropic efforts for the University of California at Berkeley. She had about 4 or 5 different digs all over the world, and she wanted someone for Egypt. So now suddenly Reisner has 3 job options. He could go to Yale for an Assyriology position that was deferred but now ready. He could go back to Berlin, become a German citizen, and keep going with his cuneiform tablets, or he could take a total right turn in his career and become an archaeologist and learn this field. And she was willing to fund him for 5 years to learn on the job, a pretty good deal. And that's the one he took. So Giza became available, as we know, and just in a few short months, take a look at this comparison. This is the Western Cemetery, west of the Great Pyramid of Khufu. In just a few short months in 1904, this is how much area was cleared. And I've circled in red just the comparison anchor points so you can see the before and after and how things look. Of course, we do things differently today, but the advantage here is that Reisner was documenting everything photographically, with journals, with maps and plans and drawings, and we'll come to see that that was really the defining aspect of his career. And it's not the subject of today's talk, but just to remind you that he worked not only at Giza and lived at Giza, but he worked at 23 different archaeological sites up and down the Nile, and even a couple of seasons in Samaria in Palestine. So everything you see in red, and I apologize that the type is probably too small to read the site names, those are all Reisner sites. First, the first 4 or 5 years under Phoebe Hearst, the Hearst expedition for University of California, and then from 1905 on, the Harvard University Boston Museum of Fine Arts expedition. And it's a great story how that dig came together in the summer of intrigue in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1905. But that's another story too. Just a smattering of the incredible finds that he made everywhere. Nubian objects, Egyptian objects, Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, everything's in there. Quite a smattering of amazing stuff. 40 plus years of digging. Probably the longest running and most successful expedition ever undertaken. And if you're into texts, we got them. papyri, medical texts that you see up above, administrative documents. The large stela here is a victory stela of Thutmose III from the imperialist 18th dynasty, found at Jebel Barkal in the Sudan. Up above there, also from the Sudan, a Middle Kingdom text about thousands of bricks that were being used in a structure. This is Amenhotep II getting drunk up in Egypt and writing a letter down to his former army buddy, Usersatet, who's now the viceroy of Kush in the Sudan, and reminiscing over old times. And this could be the Meroitic Rosetta Stone one day. So we still don't know the Nubian script and language and grammar very well of Meroitic, but someday someone will crack that code and we'll be off and running in Meroitic. Reisner, believe it or not, was also the first to discern once and for all who the Sphinx represented, and it was Khafre, most likely, the builder of the second pyramid. Yes, in 1912, that still wasn't known. There were all kinds of theories that it was a late period king, or lots of uncertainty there, but based on his excavations and statuary he'd found at the third pyramid of Menkaure, he deduced it was indeed Khafre who carved the Sphinx. Unfortunately, the press misinterpreted his remarks, and before you knew it, this kind of stuff was popping up all over the place. Atlantis, hidden chambers inside the Sphinx, temples and swimming pools underneath, and you name it, he never could live it down. So he learned an important lesson on how to deal with the media at that time. Fast forward to 1925, and this is the unfortunate split between erstwhile friends Reisner and Breasted. Breasted had been rather disgruntled with Pierre Lecoq and the way the French were running the Antiquity Service. Remember, the French ran the Antiquity Service and the British ran the government at this time. And he was hatching a scheme basically to get the French out. So with Rockefeller money, he went to the Egyptians with $10 million and a promise to build this incredible new Cairo museum right there. But also along with it came a committee with him in charge that would basically decide who gets to dig where. And this cable is from him to Reisner, saying we really need to make this foreign archaeological work a foreign interest, so we can't be ruled or run by the French or the Egyptians or anybody. Reisner saw through this and said, you know, this is never going to fly. The Egyptians are going to see right through this, and it's a little bit tone deaf, and I really think you should not go through with this. Once Reisner found out what was happening, because Breasted was working a little bit behind the scenes. And essentially Reisner won, not single-handedly, but the Egyptians did not go for the scheme, and it wasn't Breasted's finest hour. And unfortunately, the two ruptured their friendship, and it lasted for a decade. And that was a sad event in that particular case. Eventually, Rockefeller gave up, and that money went to a museum in Jerusalem. It took almost 10 years for them to become friends again. And to Breasted's credit, I will highlight this one aspect here, where Reisner was having trouble getting Harvard to fork over the money to publish his tomb development volume, and Breasted leapt in and tried to help out. He even wrote the Harvard president Conant at the time, and what this document says basically is, you know, you should help support this volume and publish it. And he says, you'll pardon me, President Conant, if I mention here, I'm not writing to you because I'm a close friend of Reisner's. On the contrary, we've had serious differences when, as Mr. Rockefeller's representative in Egypt, I was attempting to induce the Egyptian government graciously to accept $10 million as a gift from Mr. Rockefeller. My colleague, Reisner, did all in his power to frustrate the attempt. Reasons of friendship, therefore, play no part in this appeal, which I'm making to you. It is a case of plain justice of the fundamental interests of science. So, to his credit, he leapt to the assistance, and even though he had been somewhat badly burned by the whole events of 1925. And the two of them did make up, and this is a fascinating luncheon gathering where all was forgiven. The great ones of Egyptology are here, and there is Breasted along with Reisner in November 15 of 1935 at the Continental Hotel in Cairo, and this was a well-photographed luncheon. In fact, I believe in this building there should be movie footage of all of these great ones in the garden at the Continental Hotel, and I'm hoping very much that Anne Flannery and the archival team will be able to identify this footage sometime soon, and we can see these people moving around, not just AI colorized as I've done here in this particular case. It's also a famous gathering because the next morning Breasted got on the steamer to head home to New York and caught an illness and died a few days upon arrival. So this is really the last photo op where all of these people are together. Reisner, for his part, stayed at Giza. There was an intervention by the French antiquities chief and his staff saying basically, whoa there, stop digging, start publishing that huge backlog you have. He had been publishing, but Giza was lagging behind, and he agreed it's time to put the shovel down, basically, and try to write things up, and that's what he did. Unfortunately, from the 1930s on, he was afflicted by terrible cataract problems, and in the later years was basically blind. I've put together all of his signatures on the annual excavation contracts, and you can see by the end, he can't see what he's doing with the pen, and he's wearing those very thick glasses, and he was effectively blind. Because of the war, he sent his wife, Mary, and his daughter, Mary, both home to the U.S. in 1940. They had quite a circuitous route: Jerusalem, Karachi, Bombay, South Africa, and New York, arriving in August. They never saw him again. He never saw them. Tough end to his life. He had a stroke. He was basically bedridden for the last year of his life up at Harvard Camp, as the dig house was called. And he died in 1942 in the middle of the war and is buried in Old Cairo. An amazing year, an amazing career when you put it all together. So not only incredible contributions to our history of the Old Kingdom and the Pyramid Age, thanks to 40 years of working at Giza, but also, just as important, establishing the framework and the genealogies and the chronology and the history of Nubian cultures, Nubian history, from excavating all of those fortresses at the Second Cataract and pyramid fields of the kings, the Nubian kings, and even some palaces and temples and things. You're looking at the Fourth Cataract site of Jebel Barkal here. What else did he do? Modernized archaeological method. We'll get to that in a moment. All of the various types of documentation that he brought into the discipline that really were very haphazard until his time. Trained scores of American and European assistants who then went on to lead their own digs, not just in the Old World, but in the New as well, so his impact spread. And it spread even further because he believed in his Egyptian teams and his Egyptian foremen, and he trained them in all the so-called skill positions. So not just moving earth, but doing the accounts, paying the men, organizing the digs, doing the photography, keeping the records, all of this stuff. And these people went off to become the raises, or the foremen, of other excavations, and as you see here, not just in Egypt. So Reisner's impact, unknown really in this level, is reaching far and wide. Less to his credit is the way he misinterpreted Nubian civilizations, really could never quite wrap his head around the fact that an indigenous black African civilization could rival Egypt and be an equal. He tended to see the Nubians through ancient Egyptian eyes, which was somewhat difficult, but we're able to correct a lot of that today because his excavations and his documentation is so meticulously recorded. We can even talk about what I might term ancient racism and modern racism in this context, not just for him, but for many from that era. Again, primarily misinterpreting many of the Nubian achievements. And on the modern side, he believed in British rule, but a little bit more nuanced. It wasn't just pro-Western and anti-Eastern. It was really because he was suspicious of those in Cairo who would, once throwing off the yoke of British control, would then exploit the rest of the Egyptian population as well. So he was seeing it through the eyes of his Egyptian workmen from their upper Egyptian village of Kuft, and I think he was very much on their side. So lots to unpack here, lots of difficult and challenging conversations to be had. None of these people comes away all black or all white, all good or all bad. It's a nuanced situation, and I hope in the end that we won't throw the babies out with the bathwater in reassessing some of these earlier scholars. The objects went to Cairo, they went to Boston, they went to Harvard, they went to Khartoum. What else did Harvard get? Reisner's collection of detective novels. This is his only avocation. I gathered all of them in the Harvard Library one summer and studied them all. Why on earth did I do that? Because he graded them on the inside front cover. What does it say there? He says B+, well, it's an A- on this book. He says B+, but he enjoyed it in the end. Which was poor. This was written by his secretary at the time on the inside of one of the books. They have great titles: Who Cut the Colonel's Throat, The Screaming Skull, Murder Island. He was really interested in the whodunits, and I think that contributed to his deductive reasoning and putting his archaeological matrices together from time to time. It's a great collection. So we can follow the progress of the digs, getting back to Giza now, and just highlight a few of the great discoveries that he made. And I will skew this bias to his expeditions more than, say, Hermann Juncker at Giza or Salim Hassan. He started way in the far western cemetery here when he was still the Hearst expedition. Then moving on the other side of the great anonymous Mastaba 2000, he continued coming eastwards towards the Great Pyramid, made a jump over here, comes back there. I'll get into that in a moment. But in the Western Cemetery, right around this area, it was one of the great discoveries made in March of 1905. You can see that plaster covering that's covering something up, and that weird wide book that's down there is what this is all about. Removing the plaster revealed one of the greatest carved and painted tombstones of the Old Kingdom, and we can, through the magic of Photoshop, try to relive that experience in 1905. That's what hit them. Phoebe Hearst was visiting that morning, and she left, having pulled out most of her finances, and then this turned up at the same afternoon. Can you imagine? Wait, if he had a cell phone calling her up, don't you want to come back and write another check? Look what we just found here. But that's the way discoveries sometimes go, and there was nothing for it. This is the slab stela of Wepem Nefret. It's one of about 15 that are preserved. Only a few still retain their amazing colors, as you see here, but they are masterpieces. They date to Khufu's era, and they are mostly the only decoration in these large tombs. We're not at the time of decorated chapels and multi-rooms and carved walls and painted all over the place. It's just a tombstone with the most important data. And they are masterpieces, all this polychromy that you see here, right down to the typos in the name for wine, where that square box should actually be below the red mouth and not the other way around. So instead of Europe for wine, it's Yper, which makes no sense at all. So we all screw up from time to time. These are one of two amazing pieces of burial equipment under Khufu's era. The slab stele is one, and the reserve heads are another. Not the greatest term. We still don't know what these are all about. They seem to break lots of rules in ancient Egyptian art. They seem to be individual likenesses and portraiture, and the debate rages on, is there portraiture or not in ancient Egypt? I think you can see that the answer would be in the affirmative in this case. But they were never parts of complete statues. They were found, as you see in the upper left, at the bottom of burial shafts in disturbed contexts. So trying to put back together what the original situation was is pretty tricky. But they are amazing. Sometimes they even seem to show damage that some have interpreted as ritual or intentional damage, maybe to disable harm from the netherworld, or other theories as well. It's a tough one. But these are undisputed masterpieces to go along with the slab stele too. After that, things get more complex at Giza, more chapels, more decoration, more walls and things. But under Khufu's time, it's a pretty set, with a few exceptions, a pretty set operation. Well, after these mastabas from the Western Cemetery in 1905 and 1906 and 7, Reisner jumped over to the Pyramid Temple of Menkaure, the third and smallest pyramid. And at the end of this causeway, the Valley Temple, was still completely buried. No one knew it was there or where it was exactly, but he figured that out later. But first it was the Pyramid Temple. And here's a great example of the way he's thinking ahead. He said to his Egyptian photographer, who is now handling all the photography, I want you to climb a third of the way up Menkaure's pyramid every evening and take a photograph to document our progress of the expedition. And I thought, you know, that's time-lapse photography. And I put all of the glass plate negatives together to try to simulate this. Now, I'm going to save us time, and I'm going to whip through this far too fast, but take a look at putting it all together, and you can see from the end of 1906 and the beginning months of 1907, the entire temple is revealed, especially down at the bottom of the image, the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies there, that Reisner didn't expect abutted the pyramid directly. That costs more time, more money, and he ran out of cash, and he had to close the season early. The red circles, again, give you the anchor points, the same place in both images, before and after, so you can see what's going on. It's an amazing way of thinking of documentation that I don't know of any parallels as early as 1906 or 7. The most important object probably from the Pyramid Temple was this colossal statue of Menkaure, found in 3 pieces in different parts of the temple. There's little daughter Mary Reisner for scale there on the left. It went through various reconstructions and iterations in the Museum of Fine Arts when it was assigned there. It's the largest Old Kingdom royal statue that we have. Quite an amazing thing. Then it was time to try to locate the Valley Temple, and by following the washed out causeway eastwards, he was able to locate it pretty quickly, and there's an excavation shot of it. This is 1908 and 1910, one of Reisner's perhaps most difficult stratigraphic excavations, because this temple was started in stone by Menkaure, never finished, His son and successor, Shepsiskaf, tried to do it in mud brick, went through multiple building phases. Then it was inhabited later in the Old Kingdom, so it becomes priestly dwellings and storage silos and things in the courtyard. You've got funerary objects, objects of daily life, mortuary architecture, settlement archaeology, all mixed in together. But again, with the phasing and the color coding and the mapping, the meticulous documentation, we can start to pull it apart. And we know where all the masterpieces were found exactly as well. This is just some of them. Many of these in the MFA in Boston, some of them in the Cairo Museum. Among those, of course, the very famous dyad or pair statue of Menkaure and, take your pick, Queen, Mother, Goddess. Because the base is still coarse and unfinished, the inscription is not there identifying who she is. So that's the subject of another lecture, and there are various opinions on that. But my colleague Mark Lehner has been re-exploring this area. It's great to see color photographs, and because Reisner backfilled the entire temple, you can't see any of it today except when Mark Lehner uncovers it, and you see the so-called robber's hole where the dyad was found, and we're learning more information about this all the time. What else? 4 amazingly perfect triads showing Menkaure, usually standing in the middle with the goddess Hathor with her cow's horns and sun disk, and then a nome or provincial deity next, standing nearby. How many of these were there? Was there one for every nome or district in Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt? Or 4 just the beginning of the story? But spectacular things. One is in Boston, the only one where Hathor is sitting, and the other 3 are in Cairo. And there's an interesting story because originally it was 2 and 2, and one got sent back from Boston in order that the dyad could go to Boston. So some pretty good negotiating tactics going on there. Well, Reisner comes back to the formerly Italian part of the Western Cemetery for a while. He works his way closer east towards the Great Pyramid, and then he heads to other places. The Sudanese, the Nubian expeditions begin. And in fact, between 1915 and 24, there's really no serious excavation happening here, even though he's still living at Harvard Camp, which is at the very top of the slide there. He's working at Kerma and the Third Cataract and other places, El Kuru and Nuri. But in 1924 and 5, he's going to come back to Harvard to teach, and he said, you know, I want you guys, while I'm gone, to start the Eastern Cemetery. It's never been done before. It probably won't reveal anything interesting. I want you to work on that. And sure enough, since he was gone, they stumbled on something pretty special. Plaster covering here was hiding something, a stairway and a burial shaft that you see there, and they went down, and they went down, and they went down. And instead of the usual 5 feet, 10 feet, 15, it was 90 feet underground, 30 meters. And at the bottom of this was an unfinished small burial chamber with this denuded mass of material. What is going on? Gold everywhere, ceramic vessels, stone vessels, an incredible travertine or alabaster sarcophagus, these weird poles on top. There's the photo of it in the Cairo Museum in the lower left today. And the color image is actually an oil painting by our friend Joseph Lyndon Smith, the American painter. And you may remember his Persepolis paintings that were just on view here. Smith was amazing, a great friend, along with his wife Corinna, of the Reisners, and he came out every year to Egypt to paint in the tombs up and down the Nile, not just the Harvard MFA expedition. But that's his take of this tomb. They spent the next 2 years lying on mattresses and with tweezers picking up every tiny little fragment because Reisner said, if we're ever going to reconstruct this mess, we've got to know how everything collapsed, how the wood disappeared from the furniture, and what legs fell in what directions, and all kinds of things. And they finally found enough hieroglyphs to put it together that this belonged to Queen Hetepheres, the mother of Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid. This beautiful bed canopy is what you were just looking at. Those poles are what were balanced on top of the sarcophagus. Incredible 4th Dynasty inscriptions and carving, all kinds of other amazing stuff. The wood is restored, but everything else is original. These butterfly bracelets and gold vessels and alabaster and all kinds of stuff. An amazing tomb. The great surprise, of course, is when they cleaned it all out and had the VIPs come down and lifted the lid of the sarcophagus to gaze on the only intact Old Kingdom royal burial ever found, and the sarcophagus was empty. So how to interpret this matrix? The debate continues, whether she was buried there and moved, whether she was buried somewhere else, whether it's a votive deposit and it was never meant as a tomb, all kinds of reasoning. Reisner came up with quite a romantic theory that we don't have time to dive into, but it's the last word has not been written on this one. Another great find in the Eastern Cemetery is at the edge There, the other arrow shows you ahead of Paris, where we just were, but Ankaf has the second largest mastaba in all of Giza, half-brother of Khufu, architect and vizier, or prime minister, and he is now famous twice over. First, for the incredible orange bust that was found lying on its back in the exterior chapel of this huge mastaba. That's 1925. It's now in the MFA. And then more recently, the incredible find of the oldest papyri ever found on the Red Sea coast, no less, by the French, by Pierre Tallet, the Wadi El Jarf papyri that talk about the construction of the Great Pyramid and moving materials back and forth, and contain this Inspector Merer in his journal and how he's dealing with the high official Ankaf, the very same one. So Ankaf has this great overview of the valley and the delivery routes for all of these materials, and maybe that's why his giant mastaba is right at the edge of the plateau looking over that area. There's our friend Joseph Linden Smith again, this time painting on top of a Nubian pyramid. And again, the Persepolis paintings were just on view, and I hear there's work afloat to restore them and put them on long term, which would be absolutely fabulous. Well, he painted Ankaf too, not once, not twice, but 4 times. And we can even use his paintings to document the post-excavation history of this piece, the conservation history, when Smith was painting out at Harvard Camp at Giza, when he might have been back in Boston, the changes in the conservation. So fascinating stuff. Smith has made great contributions, and we're just starting to understand them. And I can't resist showing you this one too, the ethnographic experiment of Ankaf in modern dress. That is a plaster cast, so lest you think we're mistreating the antiquities, this was an experiment Dows Dunham, Reisner's assistant, did during the war when he had an extra suit and tie at the office and was amazed at how little this man had changed in so many centuries. Well, those are just a few highlights of Giza finds made by Reisner. There are, of course, so many more: ceramics, stone vessels, burial equipment, some mummies, sarcophagi in wood and in stone, all kinds of things. How do we deal with all of this material, the legacy of the Giza excavations? Well, we have 2 data sets to worry about. One of them is still there at the site, namely what is still in the mastaba tombs, these beautiful, sometimes built-up structures and sometimes rock-cut structures, as you see here, carved and painted with every aspect of Egyptian culture you might want to study. So that's data set 1. Data set 2, of course, is everything that came from Giza, that's in all of the museums, not just in Boston, but all over the world, in fact. So trying to put this stuff together and deal with it has been sort of a major life work that I've taken on for the last several decades, and thank God I'm not alone. Why do it? Why care? Why is this important? Well, all you need to do is look at the then and now comparisons to see that we are losing the battle here for preservation and conservation and study. And if we can document it and conserve it physically, fantastic. If we can do it on paper or in photographs or in reconstructions, all the better. But you can see things that were found don't look that way anymore, whether it's the salts leaching to the surface and crystallizing and tearing away the decoration, or it's vandalism, or it's climate change, or whatever the reason is. We have to get on the stick. So thank God we have Reisner's meticulous record-keeping and documentation, that he was one of the founding fathers of archaeological method. And so today is Giza, welcome to Giza, in a form that you can't access even with a trip to the pyramids physically. Incredible archives, mounted photographs, glass plate negatives. You see in the lower left, there are 45,000 Harvard MFA expedition glass plates in 3 different sizes. For Giza alone, there are 21,000 that the expedition took. And then thousands of maps and plans and drawings from single burial shafts all the way up to entire cemeteries with hundreds of tombs in them. Not only was Reisner prolific and put out tons of books and articles, but there are far more manuscript pages that never made it towards the end of his life. So Giza Necropolis 2 and 3 and 4 that you don't even know about. The world knows about these book series, and we're absorbing those too into our project. So Reisner's volumes, Hermann Juncker for the Germans did about 12 Giza volumes. Salim Hassan put out a respectable 10 for the Central Field. So we can build on these foundations. Even the MFA started a post-Reisner tomb-by-tomb publication series, thanks to my former boss, William Kelly Simpson, who was Yale professor and MFA curator, and he did the first volumes, and others contributed some of the rest. So trying to get that done, but there's so much more to do. So in the year 2000, the Mellon Foundation, God bless them, came to us and said, we have some money. Do you have any cool projects? And I thought, well, we could just scan the 45,000 photographs, but why not go another step? Why not just pull back, take the most important site, Giza, and try to do everything that we have related to Giza? This was during my MFA curator days. So the Giza project was born, and it lasted for 10 years at the MFA when I was on the curatorial staff there. We got about, all told, $3.4 million or so from the Mellon Foundation, which was fabulous. We had about 1,000 people, if you add them up between now and today. So students, PhD Egyptologists, postdocs, docents, volunteers, you name it. Here are some of them. And you can see how many years it goes back because of the thickness of the computer monitors. That's the way you date these things as we bounced around to different offices at the MFA. So a tremendous opportunity to try to become a type site for managing the big picture, an archaeological site in every aspect, and try to present what anyone might want to study. This is also hard, really hard. So which of these two things do you think you'd be able to read 5 years from now, for example, right? It's probably the bottom one, the one in stone. So we're essentially trying to create a permanent, for posterity, online repository, but we're using tools that are designed to go out of style, designed to be obsolescent every, 6 months? You name it, whether it's hardware or software. It's tough to create these kinds of archives, and I'm not alone in facing this challenge. I'm sure many in the audience are nodding and saying, yup. So, especially with the budgets that we have in the humanities, as opposed to, say, Hollywood graphical budgets and things. But this is what we came up with. We tried to figure out how to bring all this material together in a sensible way that gives you an overview. And in the center is the single tomb, the mastaba. And so we said, well, for each tomb, we've got this many of these and this many of those, and let's link them all together. So the photographs and the diaries and the objects and the plans and sections and the unpublished manuscript pages and the books and the articles and more recent photography, and now into 3D modeling and photogrammetry and all of it. It all relates together. So the mastaba, the single tomb, is the central node in our database, and all these other guys live in other modules that link to it. Then we realized, well, it's great to know everything there is to know about this Reisner tomb over here, but right next to it is a German excavated tomb, and we got nothing. So I went to Europe, and I tried to sign up, and not just Europe, but America too, all of those players. These are all the museums and institutions that have a direct archaeological connection to Giza. So not just, say, the British Museum or the Metropolitan. They have Giza objects, but they never excavated at Giza. All these places were the repositories. So they all joined in. They keep the copyrights, of course. We're just sort of the middlemen in all of this. But all of their material ended up in our system as well. So sample websites, if you search for nothing, just click the box. You can see the current totals. Something like 83,000 photographs are in there, tons of objects and things. You can search for a word or a single tomb and bring up a page like this, which is a single tomb record, and you see all the linked stuff, the finds, and then you keep going, and there's diary pages and manuscripts and plans and all kinds of stuff. Usually it's more packed, so you're not scrolling endlessly. The fun part, of course, is the photography, so you can look at any of these in gallery view or blow up the screen and play with these things. For those who know these technologies, it's IIIF compliant. We use a Mirador image viewer, which means you can pick these things and zoom in on them and annotate them and even play with the contrast and brightness settings right in a web browser without needing any particular tools. Here's one of the less happy reserve heads in this particular case, and you see the various settings that you can have fun with and play with it if you're really trying to see that hieroglyph and what to do with it. So that's all the basic search materials, and we're always trying to improve this all the time based on the time and people and money that we have. It doesn't always go as fast as we want, but we have some good improvements that I hope will be built into the system. And then once you build this stuff, you're trying to reach not just the scholars anymore, but everybody, which means Giza at school and lesson plans and what's a pharaoh and all of these things we never had to worry about when it was the Mellon Foundation that was funding all of this, and they cared just about the pure scholarship. So that's the underlying principle of the Giza project. Now moving on forward, there's new ways to deal with this material too. And that brings us back to the golden ages and what's it like now? What was it like then? How do we jump back and forth in time? Can we seamlessly do that sort of stuff? Can we perceive Giza as it is, as it was? Can we put things digitally repatriated back in their original find spots, for example? We've got all the tools to do this now. It's just a question of people power and funding. So the next step then, of course, is not just I'm searching for statue X that's in Berlin, or I'd like to see all the diary pages for tomb Y. It's now, can we do these kinds of hover over the site? Oh, that's interesting. What's that? Take me in for a closer look kind of thing. So now you can see Giza from above, maybe click on the tomb of Queen Meresank that was found in 1927, and you'll zoom in and even enter the tomb as it was. So this is the chapel of Queen Meresank. And you may be wondering, well, how do you know about all those colors? Well, down in the button there, where 3D model switches to photogrammetry, this is what it looks like today. Happens to be one of the beautifully preserved chapels, rock cut, by the way, it's underground. And so we can extrapolate from those surviving colors and restore the whole tomb like this, and actually bounce back and forth. So bringing the site sort of up to date, up to speed, helping people visualize it a little bit better. Lots of ways that you can do this when you have the data, when it's based on solid excavations and solid documentation as well. How else can we experience this site? Virtually, of course. So imagine being at Giza, but not really being at Giza. These people are wearing headsets and visors. They're in Paris, and they think they're on top of the Great Pyramid wandering around. So these are getting better all the time and less painful and less nauseating. And there are some great potentials I see here. How about scale? Time to have a sense of proportion. What could you learn from these sites if you really could tower above the pyramids yourself and actually see over that hill and over that mastaba and how things align and how they were originally laid out? And this is all possible with these types of virtual experiences now. If you want to be at the site yourself and you want a dose of better reality, we're trying to accommodate you here. This is a sort of Google Street View-like approach that really gives you a sense of the scale and what it's like to wander up and down the streets of the mastabas here. This is in the Western Cemetery. We're walking south towards Khafre. How is this done, you ask? I'll swing around and actually show you. It's just a 360 camera on an invisible selfie stick. See the shadow on the sand there? The camera just erases it, and it looks like a drone is hovering above his head there. So we have about 63 of these all over the site now, and I'd love to get comprehensive coverage this way and do it from the air as well. For those searching for new apartments and condos, you know what it's like to go on a real estate website and cruise through the living room and out onto the patio, and no reason why you can't do this with ancient monuments as well. So imagine all of Giza tombs or any archaeological site being accessible this way, where you choose where you want to go, and question of just resolution and access. And of course, you can embed hotspots and text that pops up or gives you more information on any of these things as well. What about introducing humans into the picture for scale and for context? Now, this is even more dangerous because now you're assigning a context to a certain room. What if that room was used for many things? What do you do then? And so many ways to screw up. Should these guys be dressed in these kilts? You don't want to put a New Kingdom costume on an Old Kingdom official. No one's clean shaven in the Old Kingdom, so you need the wigs. You have the leopard skin. Here they are performing the opening of the mouth ceremony on the deceased King Khufu, reanimating his spirit. But how many people are here? Do we have the gestures right based on the tomb wall representations? How many of those statues around the niches were there? And even what time of day does this ceremony take place? Are we even putting them in the right part of the temple here? So these can get a little bit risky, but they also bring the fascinating opportunities for teaching, especially to try to bring the ancient context back to life and help people understand what these structures were for. And when you build these models, then suddenly you can ask new research questions and things pop up that by conventional methods you might not have been familiar with. Here's Meresank again with the beautiful restored chapel, and we notice that there's a window outside the tomb there, and in reconstructing the tomb and reconstructing the course of the sun, we notice that it shoots right through that window and actually illuminates the false door, sort of a sacred offering niche, right opposite, right through that doorway and right on the western wall there. And that's not an accident. And if we start to look around in other tombs, we see, oh, there's another window, and it too is shining right on a sacred space. And here's another tomb, and this is a famous one, and it too leads right in that takes you eventually down to the burial chamber there. So kind of interesting stuff going on. And in fact, with Meres Ankh, if you calculate the tomb next door and when the sunlight was blocked or not blocked, now suddenly you've got a matrix relationship. Oh, that must have been there first, and that must have not been there because it wouldn't have blocked the sunlight as originally conceived. And so now I'm chronologically or historically reconstructing the development of the necropolis. So some pretty cool stuff can come up this way. Here's another fantasy of mine. This is a less exciting burial chamber in the Western Cemetery, dug originally in 1906 and then photographed in 36. But down below you see we are getting what I call the tomb's eye view of Giza, rotating in the bedrock around the burial shaft and the burial chamber, and see what a comprehension it gives you of how these things were excavated and constructed, and more importantly, all those other burial shafts in the distance. I want to get them all built in the same level of archaeological detail, and then start to understand necropolis management. Who kept the records and said, well, you can't sink a shaft over there because Imhotep's got one right nearby and you're going to crash into his, and we can't allow that sacred space to be intruded upon. So how are these things managed has always fascinated me. Who's going to guide us around this stuff? Is it George Reisner? Is it Queen Meres Ankh herself? How do we sort of bring these things alive for school groups or make the tombs intelligible? What if you could look at the wall and say, what's that? And pop it right off the wall in 3 dimensions and rotate it around. This is the carrying chair that you see represented right there in 2D, and then here it is in 3D. So lots of potential in that kind of thing too. And then we can give the sense of how deep Hediperes's burial shaft is. G7000X, the mother of Khufu. There again is the Joseph Lyndon Smith painting in the upper right, all the way down here. But now, instead of the denuded mess that was found in 1925, we can restore it, put it all back together, and see what it looked like in the 4th dynasty. And that's where we're headed now, if we ever make it to the bottom of the shaft and into this very simple, very tight and small burial chamber. And there it is as the 4th dynasty Egyptians would have seen it and experienced it. And again, that's an empty royal sarcophagus that really shouldn't have been empty. Well, we took this one step further because everyone knows the reconstruction of Hediperes's furniture. There's a reconstructed, restored set in the Cairo Museum. The MFA had a second set, which is no longer on view, but it was well known in Boston for a long time. But there was a second chair that was never put together because it was just too complicated until Reisner's successor, William Stevenson Smith, figured it out in 1949, years after Reisner's death. And that's what you see in his drawings down below. So we modeled it. And then we thought, what if we went in the opposite direction? Usually people have the real world and they make a model of it. What if we just have a model and let's try to make it in the real world too? So we went to the Cairo Museum and studied the fragments. We hooked up a computer to our computer model and this routing machine, and you can see it's actually carving because we're lousy at craftsmanship, but the machine does a pretty good job. This is the arm of that falcon chair that does not exist on view in the Cairo Museum. No one has seen it before. But we put it all together with real gold, and we learned how to make faience inlay tiles, and there it is, and it's on view in the H. Main, or Art Museum at Harvard now. And we actually pulled that off to recreate the Queen's chair. I'm wondering when the Egyptians are going to say, can we have one too? And I don't know if I can make a second one or not, but it came out very well. And we learned so much about the craftsmanship process. Obviously, the Egyptians didn't have computer-driven routers, but does the faience go in before the gilding or the gilding first? And learning so much about how that came together was a great experiment. Well, I'm almost intimidated to talk about epigraphy or digital epigraphy in this building where it is done so masterfully, but that's part of our project too. And frankly, I've taken what I learned from my 3 years at Chicago House and Luxor, and the same principles, high-res photography and then the drawing, and then take away the photographic layer. And this kind of epigraphic work is a part of our project as well. And I'm pleased that a few years ago we teamed up actually with the epigraphic survey team to explore different ways of converting older publications into digital online publications. So here, for example, my colleagues, Christian Vertesch and Owen Murray and Ariel Singer have been playing with these apps that let you use your slider and look at archival photography or newer photography, or toggle back and forth between the epigraphic line drawing and the original monument. Another one lets you scroll down and read the text, and it highlights the parts of the inscription in question. So great potential for making these tombs more accessible. But the danger in all of this, of course, is the documentation. It's kind of still the wild, wild west out there in graphical representation of ancient monuments. What format are you using? Is it open source? Is it going to disappear in a year? What if that company goes out of business? How come that wall is 3 feet high? What's your evidence? Why isn't it 5 feet high? So we need this kind of backup paperwork. And my colleague in the Giza project, Nick Picardo, has really brought this front and center to try to build the documentation behind why we made that decision, why that wall has been plastered, and why this one's mud brick and that one's stone. And hopefully these will get up onto the website too. So when you ask those questions, why is that wall so high? We can say, well, it's built on this Reisner plan, or that photo, or Hamron Juncker said it in his book, see page 32, and we can actually build a bit of a paper trail, even if it's digital, so that we've got a little less wild, wild west, lack of standardization and formats. I've become fascinated, too, with Harvard Camp, the dig house of the expedition, over 40 years. And there it is in the western part of the site, west of Khafre's pyramid. By the 1930s, it had a tennis court, just like Chicago House. It had a central courtyard there, and kitchens, and housing, and all kinds of stuff. And this was really mission control, even when the expedition was down in the Sudan or in other parts in Egypt. This is where all the objects came. This is where the books and articles got written. People came to consult with Reisner, not only about archaeology, but about the politics in Cairo and what was happening in Parliament and what did it mean for archaeology. Reisner was fluent in Arabic. He was reading the papers every morning and was really quite a source on all kinds of things. There's a view inside some of the rooms at Harvard Camp. And this brings a parallel to mind, not the Chicago House you all know of Luxor, but for about 5 or 6 years, there was another Chicago House nearby at Memphis. And there is a beautiful illustration of the Saqqara Chicago House and interior views. I have these because the director was Prentice Duell for many years, and he was a Harvard man. And I found a photo album that was in his archives, in the Harvard archives, that show some amazing photography of what a place this was. But back to Harvard Camp, we got so interested in this as a teaching tool that we decided to build it. And so there it is, based on photography and some simple plans and photographs and descriptions from the various guests and people who lived there. The courtyard was always loaded with objects. I'm kind of cheating time in a way here because all of these pieces you see here were found in different years, of course. They were never in the courtyard together. Ankaf is 1925. The triads there are 1908, the dyad is 1910, that reserve head was 1913. The cat, I don't know what the cat dates to, but the camp is really a fascinating place, and you see even the Remington typewriters that we see in photography. There's object register books here and diaries. There's a photo studio and the large format cameras and things. In the lower right, the black and white photo is showing you the real courtyard and where we get our inspiration. So this has been a pretty interesting experiment, and you'll see where we're going with this. We use this in teaching, and this is our special visualization lab classroom at Harvard where I teach my Giza courses, and the students can put on the 3D headsets and go there. We even tried streaming this course live to students at Zhejiang University in China. Poor things, it was midnight there, and they didn't want to speak up too loud because their roommates would be awakened, but it was an interesting experiment. But the next step in all of this, or what I like to think of as maybe Zoom 2.0, is to go to Harvard Camp and give the lecture, give the class from Harvard Camp. So you can see the illusion there. It looks like I'm at the site, and we'll pan around behind that screen and you'll see how the illusion is built. It's 2 walls, with 3D projector, and a floor, and there it is. How illusory that is, but it actually looks like I can speak from there. And I could beam in someone against a green screen in Singapore and we could have a conversation as if we're both standing right there. That table isn't there, that's just projected in front of me, and I'm holding an iPad and I can pop up an object and I can play with it, I can magnify it or rotate it if we want to study the inscriptions on one side or the other side there. So I think it's a way to bring Harvard Camp into the picture, or bring us into the picture of Harvard Camp. And then it's all a question of scale. who are you bringing this info to? Is it a one-person experience? Is it a small class, like the 20 seats in the visualization lab? Is it a larger gen ed type of course? We have some of those at Harvard too. That may look like a big scale, but then there's an online free Giza course that we do through the edX or the HarvardX platform. And at last count, I think that was up to 124,000 students in about 140 countries. So exponentially, you have the chance to reach different people with different expectations and different knowledge levels, of course, too. But it takes you far outside the original classroom. A couple of individual objects and how we can play with these. This is the Sphinx, and 1,000 years after the Sphinx, Thutmose IV put this stela right between the front paws there. We have a resin replica, full size, in our museum here, and since we couldn't reproduce the Sphinx, we don't have the ceiling height. Instead, we built an AR app, which you can download from the Google Play or the Apple Store, called Dreaming the Sphinx, and it can animate, just aim your phone at it, and it pops up either on your computer screen or your phone and tells the story how the young prince fell asleep in the shadow of the Sphinx, and the Sphinx appeared to him and said, "Dude, I am so covered in sand. If you will dig me out, I will make you pharaoh." And that's what happened. And that's what the story is on the stela. And so aim at the stela, and you can actually read it line by line on your phone. The English translation flips with the AR projected, the augmented reality projection, right onto the stela, and you can read along in the hieroglyphs. Or you can stand between the paws of the Sphinx and look up at it, and you can slide the time slider, so that's the old kingdom before the stela was added. Then you can flip to the new kingdom when it's there, and you can see a statue was probably added as well, or flip to now, for example, and you can see the current state of the whole thing. There it is. So different ways to experience it. Objects take on new life when they get 3D scanned, as you see here with the dyad. And then from 3D scanning, we move on to 3D printing, of course. This was a fun experiment because that head is in Boston, but we happen to know that the body is in Cairo. So 3D print one in this garish blue color so that no one at the Cairo airport would think I was stealing an antiquity. And there it is in the Grand Egyptian Museum, fitting perfectly onto this Dynasty 26 body. Which is an interesting experiment, from the 3D scan to the 3D print. So no end of these types of mass productions that you could use in the classroom. But I've become a believer that sometimes being in the presence of the object, there's still information you want and you don't get in the gallery. We have these 3 Dynasty 22 coffins that are fabulous, but you can't lift the lids. You can't walk all the way around them. They're against the wall in the cases. But with the models that are on the Sketchfab website, freely accessible to anyone, you can drive that bus. You can rotate around. You can stop the animation. You can lift the lid, look at the paintings inside, look from below and up above. So these are the types of enhancements that I think belong with the objects, not to distract, not to replace, but to belong with them. And our Sketchfab library has all of these Giza objects, and they're freely rotatable and downloadable and accessible to everyone. We have a virtual gallery designing assignment in one of my courses, and this is where the students grab the text from. For my Assyriology friends, I'll give one example here. This is our 3rd floor, where we have, again, modern resin casts of a lot of the Assyrian palace reliefs along the walls, and I want to bring them to life too. So we've been working with Assyriological colleagues who know all about ancient colors and restoring the colors. But the next step is I want everyone to aim their phone at a different relief, and the relief tells its story. It comes alive and animates, either with music or with the action. The poor lion gets the arrows thrown in there. The king is riding along in his chariot. We haven't done this for all the reliefs yet. This is sort of a demo, but could be applied to the Egyptian sphere of things too. So where is this all going? I have no idea. Apple has just announced this new mixed reality headset, which is a leap forward, and we'll see what happens next year, whether this is really everything Apple wants you to believe it is. But there's new potential here of bringing some pretty good experiences, hopefully without the nausea and the heavy headsets and all of the other clunkiness that up to this point has plagued the VR industry. With that, I want to finish up, because you've been very patient, and I think I've taken too much of your time already, but I want to give voice to the voiceless a little bit here. And we've been talking about an awful lot of Westerners, and I want to finish up with the Egyptians, because they are at center stage after all. Reisner was very progressive with his Egyptian team. They were all Kuftis from the village of Kuft, or Koptos, in Upper Egypt, and he started with this young fella named Syed Ahmed Syed. He was carrying Reisner's camera bag, but he was obviously so sharp and so with it that before you knew it, he was taking over all of the glass plate photography, and then he became the Rais, or the foreman, and ran the whole show. There he is, AI colorized, but nevertheless, you see him in older age. He died tragically in the middle of the Head of Paris excavations in 1926, but his two sons, Mohammed and Mahmoud, took over, and they did a fantastic job too. Here's Reisner's 70th birthday party. And I actually found one of his 9 kids, Mohammed's 9 kids, years ago. It was a privilege to meet him. This is Hassan Diraz, not involved in archaeology, but very interested in the family history. And he said, I've wanted to meet you for a while because I have this. And I thought, what's that? And it's an Arabic expedition diary book. And my jaw picked up off the floor again. He's thinking, ka-ching. And he said, you know, if you like that, I have 73 more of these in my village in Upper Egypt. And this is an absolutely unique corpus of Arabic excavation diaries kept by Reisner's foreman from all sites, not just Giza. It's about 73 books, 100 pages each, 7,000 pages, viewing the excavation through Egyptian eyes, something that no other expedition has access to, even copying hieroglyphic inscriptions at times here, beautiful detailed maps and plans and sections, even some deductive reasoning, which no one has ever been willing to give the Egyptians credit for before. Look at this one talking about the reserve heads. Syed Ahmed says, I just realized that the shafts we excavated after your departure to Kerma do not have reserve heads. I think the reason for that is there are no sarcophagi of white limestone in these shafts. We found reserve heads in all the shafts with a limestone sarcophagus or fragments of one. So the shaft that does not have a limestone sarcophagus does not have a reserve head. This is what I think, only God knows. But fascinating stuff. These guys are not just moving earth. They're interpreting, they're thinking, they're on the front lines. And we have a wonderful Arabic diaries project now in the works, and we have a great international team studying these, not only for the archaeology, but for the labor relations, for the Middle Arabic, the dialects here, what's going on in Upper Egypt, the grammatical mistakes. Are these people dictating? Are they writing it themselves? How many hands do we have? We've even found a company in Paris that can do OCR, optical character recognition conversion of handwritten Arabic into Arabic word files, so we're looking forward to studying those as well. So lots of different directions that we can go in. I hope you see now why we're in this third golden age of Giza archaeology and maybe archaeology in general, but it all goes back to the foundation that Reisner laid. Without all of that documentation, in and year out, living at Harvard camp, the glass plate negatives, the writings, the manuscripts, the plans, none of that would be possible. And here is my shameless plug for trying to get the story right and put his story out there, not just for Giza, but from all of the different sites that he worked at. So it remains just to thank many of our Giza partners and sponsors in all of these years. And without them, of course, none of this would happen. And I thank you very much for joining us tonight.